What would you do if the love of your life, the person you trusted completely, betrayed you in ways you never imagined? This is the story of David and Azel, a couple whose seemingly perfect life unraveled in the face of secrets and lies. From the early days of love and shared dreams to the heartbreak of infidelity, David's journey is one of resilience, discovery, and the fight to protect what truly matters. As betrayal unfolds and consequences take hold, this story reveals the power of choices and the strength it takes to rebuild after losing it all. Stay with me. You won't believe how this story ends. David and Azel's love story felt like a dream. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable spark, something rare, something extraordinary. It wasn't just chemistry. It was a connection built on shared values, dreams, and an unshakable belief in each other. Together, they envisioned a future filled with promise, laughter, and unwavering support. They weren't just partners. They were each other's best friends. Every moment they spent together solidified the foundation of their love, and they felt invincible. People around them would often remark on how perfect they seemed, and honestly, they believed it too. But as perfect as it all looked, life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. And while they couldn't see it then, the first cracks had already begun to form. Their early days were full of discovery and excitement, each moment bringing them closer. They'd stay up late talking about their future, David as an engineer and Azel exploring her passion for sales. They laughed about how their differences complemented each other, imagining how they'd balance their strengths to build a life together. Faith played a central role in their relationship, a guiding light they leaned on during tough times. They prayed together, planned together, and believed that as long as they had each other, they could overcome anything. Everything felt perfect, almost too perfect. But sometimes when you're blinded by love, you miss the subtle shifts. Little did they know, their journey was about to take unexpected turns. David often admired how Azel seemed to light up every room she walked into. Her energy was infectious, her optimism unwavering. Together, they built a relationship filled with trust and laughter. Date nights were their sacred tradition, a time to reconnect despite their busy schedules. David cherished these moments, seeing them as proof of their commitment. Azel, too, seemed equally invested, or so he thought. Looking back, there were moments, small, fleeting, that didn't seem significant at the time. A forgotten detail here, a distracted glance there. But love makes you overlook things, doesn't it? It's funny how the mind fills in gaps, making everything seem perfect even when it's not. Their love grew quickly, and with it came a sense of certainty about their future. They shared everything, dreams, fears, and even mundane details of their day. For David, Azel wasn't just his partner, she was his anchor, his confidant. They'd often talk about the family they wanted to build, picturing a life surrounded by love and joy. The connection they had felt unbreakable, a bond that could weather any storm. Friends and family admired their closeness, calling them the perfect couple. And for a while it seemed true. But the foundation of their love, though seemingly solid, had hidden weaknesses. Love can mask so much, can't it? And sometimes it takes a storm to reveal the cracks beneath. Their story was one of hope and promise, a love built on shared dreams and unshakable faith. David believed with all his heart that their connection was different, stronger than most. But life, as they'd soon learn, has a way of testing even the strongest of bonds. While the early days of their relationship were filled with laughter and optimism, challenges loomed on the horizon, unseen and unspoken. David had no idea that the perfect picture they'd painted would soon be tainted by choices and secrets. For now, they were happy, blissfully unaware of what lay ahead. But, as the saying goes, the higher the climb, the harder the fall. David and Azel's life seemed to follow the perfect script. David, a hard-working engineer, was steadily climbing the ranks in his field. His dedication and brilliance didn't just earn him promotions, it earned him respect. Azel, with her knack for connection and charm, was thriving in sales, outpacing her goals and building a name for herself. Together they were a powerhouse a couple others aspired to emulate. It felt like the world was smiling on them, rewarding their efforts and their love. And just when they thought things couldn't get better, a gift arrived, a house, offered by David's parents, brimming with possibilities and memories yet to be made. It felt like the final piece of their perfect puzzle, a tangible symbol of their shared dreams. The house was everything they'd hoped for, spacious, yet cozy, with room to grow into a family. David's parents had spared no detail, making sure it was a place where love could flourish. "It's a foundation for your future," his father had said, handing David the keys. Azel's eyes sparkled as she imagined decorating the rooms, hosting dinners, and creating traditions. For David, it wasn't just a house, it was a promise, a commitment to a future they were building together. They spent weekends painting walls, choosing furniture, and dreaming about the life they'd create within those four walls. Each decision felt like a step closer to their shared vision. Yet as perfect as it all seemed, there was an uneasiness that David couldn't quite name. Their days were filled with accomplishments and celebrations, milestones that seemed to affirm their path. David's career was taking off, and Azel was earning accolades for her success in sales. They were proud of what they'd achieved, individually and as a couple. Friends and family often marveled at their partnership, calling them a team in every sense of the word. But with every step forward, life became busier, their schedules tighter. Conversations grew shorter, and the time they once spent together dwindled. David convinced himself it was just a phase, the natural result of ambition and hard work. But deep down, he missed the simplicity of their early days, the quiet moments that had once brought them so much joy. As time passed, the house became a reflection of their success, a place filled with laughter and plans for the future. David often found himself thinking about his parents' generosity, their belief in his relationship with Azel. He wanted to honor that belief, to prove that their investment in his happiness hadn't been misplaced. Azel too seemed equally committed, or so it appeared. She spoke often about the memories they were creating, her excitement about their future together. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. It wasn't obvious, just a faint undercurrent he couldn't ignore. He told himself it was nothing, that life was simply moving fast. But as he'd soon learn, life had a way of catching up. From the outside, David and Azel's life looked picture perfect. A beautiful home, flourishing careers, and the unwavering support of family. But perfection is a delicate thing, easily fractured by unseen forces. David was proud of their accomplishments, of the life they were building together. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting, where he felt a disconnect, like they were living parallel lives instead of one. He brushed it off, attributing it to stress and the demands of success. Little did he know, those fleeting moments would soon grow into something impossible to ignore. The foundation they had worked so hard to build was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The day the twins were born, everything changed. David remembered holding them for the first time, tiny and fragile, and feeling a love so overwhelming it almost brought him to tears. Azel looked radiant despite the exhaustion, her face glowing with pride as she cradled their daughters. They named them Emma and Sophia, two little miracles who seemed to complete their family. The sleepless nights and endless diaper changes didn't faze them, at least not at first. They were a team navigating parenthood together, or so David believed. But even as their days filled with baby laughter and new milestones, something began to shift. Parenthood was beautiful, yes, but it also brought challenges neither of them had fully anticipated. With the twins came a whirlwind of joy and chaos. Late nights turned into early mornings, and their once balanced routine was thrown into disarray. David found himself working longer hours to provide for his growing family, while Azel juggled motherhood with her demanding sales job. At each year, first it felt like they were managing, but cracks began to show. They started talking less, their conversations reduced to logistics and schedules. "Did you pick up formula?" Replaced, "How was your day?" David missed their connection but convinced himself it was temporary, a small price to pay for the joy their daughters brought. Still, there were moments when he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Azel's dedication to her work didn't waver, even after the twins arrived. David admired her drive, her ability to balance, so much, but he couldn't help but feel left out. She seemed preoccupied, always rushing from one task to the next, while David tried to anchor himself in the little moments. Bedtime stories, first words, and tiny handprints on the walls. He wished they could share those moments more, like they had in the past. Instead, they felt like two ships passing in the night, tethered by responsibility but drifting apart. David told himself it was just a phase, that things would settle eventually, but in the back of his mind, doubts began to take root. The twins brought immeasurable joy, but they also reshaped David and Azel's relationship. Time once spent together was now devoted to the girls, leaving little room for anything else. David noticed Azel becoming more distant, her smiles less frequent, her laughter fading. He tried to bridge the gap, suggesting date nights or family outings, but her responses were always the same. "I'm too tired," or "maybe next week." David wanted to believe it was just exhaustion, that the demands of parenthood were taking their toll. Yet, the warmth that had once defined their relationship felt like it was slipping away. He clung to the hope that things would improve, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Despite the growing distance, David held on to the belief that their love could withstand anything. The twins were their greatest blessing, and he was determined to make it work. For them, for their family. He told himself that the sacrifices were worth it, that the long nights and missed connections were just temporary hurdles. But deep down, a part of him wondered if Azel felt the same. There was an unease in her eyes he couldn't quite place, a tension he couldn't ignore. He didn't realize it then, but their relationship had reached a turning point. The cracks were there, widening with each passing day, and soon they would be impossible to overlook. David always believed their love was unshakable. Through every challenge, every sleepless night with the twins, he clung to the idea that their bond was stronger than anything life could throw at them. Trust was their foundation, it always had been. They shared everything, from their biggest dreams to their smallest fears. David prided himself on their openness, on the way they could talk about anything without hesitation. Azel used to say, "You're my rock," and he believed her. Even as life became more chaotic, David never doubted her commitment. Why would he? They'd built a life together, one rooted in faith and honesty. At least, that's what he thought. But sometimes trust can blind you to the truth. There were no secrets between them, or so David believed. They had shared passwords, joint bank accounts, and a life intertwined in every possible way. If something was wrong, wouldn't he know? He convinced himself that the distance he felt was just stress, a phase they'd work through together. Azel had always been transparent, or at least she seemed to be. When her phone buzzed late at night or she mentioned staying late at work, David didn't question it. Why would he? Suspicion wasn't in his nature, and Azel had never given him a reason to doubt her. But trust, as David would soon learn, can sometimes be the perfect disguise for deception. Their routines became predictable, almost mechanical. David chalked it up to the demands of parenthood, to the sacrifices that came with raising a family. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Azel was still attentive, still present, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, an edge to her laughter, a distance in her gaze. When he brought it up, she'd dismiss it with a tired smile. "You're overthinking," she'd say, and David would let it go. After all, he trusted her completely. But trust, he'd come to realize, can make you blind to the signs staring you in the face. David often found himself reminiscing about the early days of their relationship, the simplicity of their love before life became so complicated. Back then, everything felt easy, natural. Now it felt like they were constantly treading water, trying to keep their heads above the waves. Still, he believed in them, in the strength of their bond. He reassured himself that they were just in a rough patch, that every relationship went through its ups and downs. But deep down, a small voice whispered doubts he wasn't ready to face. Trust had always been his anchor, but lately, It felt more like a weight pulling him under. Despite the growing cracks in their relationship, David refused to give up. He loved Azel, and he believed she loved him too. Trust was the cornerstone of their marriage, and he was determined to hold on to it. He ignored the unease in his gut, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. After all, love wasn't perfect, it was messy and complicated, and it required faith. But as David would soon discover, faith alone wasn't enough. The foundation of trust he'd built their relationship on was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. And once the cracks began to show, there would be no turning back. When Azel mentioned the work trip, David didn't think much of it. She'd been to conferences before, and her dedication to her career was one of the things he admired most about her. "It's just a few days," she had said, packing her suitcase with precision. David nodded, brushing off the small pang of unease that tugged at him. She'd always been ambitious, and he wanted to support her in every way. But as she kissed him goodbye, promising to call every night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. He told himself he was being silly, that his worries were unfounded. Yet deep down, a tiny voice whispered that this trip would be different. The first night Azel was away, David tried to keep busy. He played with the twins, caught up on work, and even started a movie they'd meant to watch together. But something felt off. Her usual check-in call came later than expected, her voice sounding distant and distracted. "Sorry, it's been hectic," she explained, brushing off his concern. David wanted to believe her, but the unease in his chest wouldn't go away. He shook his head, trying to laugh at himself. "You're being ridiculous," he muttered, convincing himself it was all in his head. But as the nights passed, her calls grew shorter, her excuses more frequent. And with each unanswered question, David's doubts grew louder. Azel's trip seemed to stretch on forever, the days dragging as David managed the household alone. He'd always been proud of her work ethic, but this time, her absence felt different. He found himself wondering who she was spending her time with, what her days looked like. When she sent a photo of the event, surrounded by colleagues, David's stomach tightened. Her smile seemed forced, her eyes distant. He hated feeling suspicious, hated the creeping doubt that made him question everything. But he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't adding up, and he needed answers. Still, he held back, convincing himself to wait until she returned. Maybe then things would feel normal again, or maybe they wouldn't. The day Azel returned, David was relieved to have her back. But the moment she walked through the door, he knew something had changed. She hugged him quickly, her movements hurried and detached, before heading upstairs to unpack. "How was the trip?" he asked, his tone casual, though his heart raced. "Busy," she replied, her back turned to him. Her answers were short, her energy subdued. It felt like she'd brought the distance back with her, leaving David to wonder what had really happened while she was away. That night, as they lay in bed, David stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The trip might have ended, but the questions it raised had only just begun. Days after her return, David found himself replaying their conversations, searching for clues in her words and actions. He wanted to believe her, to trust the woman he'd built his life with. But the nagging feeling in his chest refused to let go. It wasn't just the trip, it was everything. The late calls, the distracted glances, the subtle shifts in her behavior. David couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed between them, and he didn't know how to fix it. But as much as he wanted to avoid the truth, he knew he couldn't. The cracks in their relationship were growing, and it was only a matter of time before they shattered completely. It started with a message from an old friend, a casual text, that would change everything. David glanced at his phone, expecting something routine, but what he saw made his heart stop. Attached were photos of Azel, her arm linked with another man's, her smile radiant in a way David hadn't seen in months. The caption read, "Thought you should see this." His chest tightened as he stared at the images, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Where were they? And why did Azel look so at ease, so carefree? David tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was innocent, a work event taken out of context. But the longer he looked, the harder it became to believe his own excuses. Denial was his first reaction. He convinced himself there had to be an explanation, something logical that would clear this up. Azel had never given him a reason to doubt her before, but the photos didn't lie. They were at a restaurant, one David didn't recognize, and the way she leaned into the man felt too intimate to dismiss. David's stomach churned as he scrolled through the images, each one more damning than the last. His mind replayed every moment of the past few weeks, searching for signs he might have missed. The late calls, the rushed goodbyes, the distance, it all started to make sense. But even as the pieces fell into place, he wasn't ready to confront the truth. That evening, David couldn't look at Azel the same way. She seemed oblivious, laughing with the twins and moving through the house like nothing was wrong. But every glance felt like a dagger. Every smile a reminder of the photos on his phone. David stayed quiet, his thoughts swirling as he watched her from across the room. He wanted to ask her about the photos, to demand an explanation, but fear held him back. What if he was wrong? What if confronting her only made things worse? For now, he decided to wait, to gather more information before jumping to conclusions. But the weight of suspicion was unbearable, and David knew he couldn't keep this to himself for long. The photos became an obsession, a puzzle David couldn't stop trying to solve. He stared at them late into the night, analyzing every detail, searching for something, anything that would make it all make sense. Who was the man? A colleague? A friend? Someone she'd mentioned in passing? The questions were endless, each one more painful than the last. David felt like a stranger in his own life, trapped in a reality he didn't recognize. He started noticing little things. Her phone turned face down, her sudden need for privacy. It was as if the photos had opened a door he couldn't close, revealing a side of Azel he'd never seen before. And with each passing day, the distance between them grew. David knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The photos were proof that something was wrong, a crack in the facade of their perfect life. But confronting Azel wasn't just about the images. It was about everything they represented. The trust they'd built, the life they'd created. It all felt fragile now, as if one wrong move could bring it crashing down. David wrestled with his emotions, torn between anger, sadness, and a desperate need for answers. The truth was out there, just beyond his reach, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He didn't know what he'd find, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The photos were just the beginning, a spark that ignited David's need for answers. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, not when doubt had taken root in his heart. So after days of agonizing over his next move, he made a decision he never thought he'd have to. He hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but desperation pushed him forward. He needed the truth, no matter how painful. Sitting in the investigator's office, David explained his suspicions, handing over the photos with trembling hands. The investigator's calm demeanor was reassuring, though it couldn't ease David's growing unease. "We'll find out what's going on," the man promised, and with that, the waiting began. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Every time David's phone buzzed, his heart raced, wondering if it was the investigator with an update. He tried to focus on his daily routines, work, the twins, anything to keep his mind occupied, but it was no use. The uncertainty consumed him, the what-ifs playing on a loop in his head. Azel, oblivious to his inner turmoil, carried on as usual, her behavior unchanged. But to David, every word, every action felt like a potential clue. He hated the way he was starting to view her, the woman he'd loved and trusted completely. And yet he couldn't stop himself. The truth was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. When the call finally came, David felt a mix of relief and dread. The investigator's tone was professional, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "I've found some things you should see," he said, arranging a meeting. David's stomach churned as he drove to the office, his mind racing. with possibilities. What would the evidence show? Was he overreacting, or was his worst fear about to be confirmed? Sitting across from the investigator, David braced himself as a folder was placed in front of him. Inside were photos, recordings, and messages, proof that Azel's relationship with her boss Jonathan went far beyond professional. The reality of it hit David like a wave, leaving him numb and breathless. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving no room for doubt. Photos of Azel and Jonathan together, texts that hinted at secret meetings, and even audio recordings of their conversations. David felt like he was living someone else's nightmare, unable to reconcile the woman in the evidence with the wife he thought he knew. He tried to process it all, but the emotions came too fast. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and a hollow sadness he couldn't shake. The investigator's voice broke through his thoughts, offering condolences and advice, but David barely heard him. His world had been shattered, and there was no going back. The trust he'd built his life on was gone, replaced by a painful, undeniable truth. Driving home, David felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the chaos. The evidence had answered his questions, but it also raised new ones. What would he do next? How would he confront Azel, and what would it mean for their family? The thought of the twins brought a lump to his throat. They deserved stability, a life free from the fallout of their parents' choices. But David knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The time for denial was over. The proof was there, staring him in the face, and it was up to him to decide what came next. One thing was certain: the confrontation ahead would be the hardest moment of his life. David didn't sleep the night before. The evidence sat on the kitchen table, a physical reminder of everything he'd discovered. He stared at it for hours, trying to decide how to approach Azel. Confrontation wasn't his nature. He preferred calm discussions, finding solutions together. But this time there was no easy way out. He thought about the twins, about the life they'd built, and the weight of it all pressed down on him. When morning came, Azel entered the kitchen with a cheerful "good morning," oblivious to the storm brewing. David's heart pounded as he gestured for her to sit. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but heavy. She froze, her smile fading as she met his gaze. The air between them was thick with tension as David slid the folder across the table. Azel hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. As she flipped through the contents, her expression shifted: confusion, disbelief, and finally, guilt. "David, I can explain," she began, her voice faltering, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "Explain what?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "The photos? The messages? The lies?" Each word felt like a weight lifted, but also like a knife twisting deeper. Azel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment David felt a pang of pity. But the betrayal was too fresh, the pain too raw. He needed answers, not excuses. Azel's explanations came in fragments, each one more desperate than the last. "It wasn't what it looked like," she insisted, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, just once. I didn't mean for this to happen." But David wasn't sure he believed her. The evidence told a different story, one of repeated lies and calculated deceit. He listened silently, his emotions a turbulent mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Part of him wanted to shout, to let his frustration explode, but another part just felt numb. "How could you do this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Azel looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Her silence said more than any words could. The conversation spiraled as emotions boiled over. Azel begged for forgiveness, promising to change, to do whatever it took to fix their marriage. But David struggled to process her words. Could he trust her again? Could he rebuild what she had broken? He thought about their past, the love they once shared, and the family they'd created. But he also thought about the lies, the betrayal, and the pain he felt in that moment. "This isn't just about us," he said, his voice cracking. "It's about Emma and Sophia. They deserve better than this." Azel nodded, tears streaming down her face, but David wasn't sure she truly understood the damage she'd done. The path forward felt impossible to navigate. By the time the confrontation ended, both were emotionally drained. David sat at the table long after Azel had retreated to their bedroom, her sobs echoing faintly through the house. He stared at the folder, the weight of its contents heavier than ever. The conversation had provided some answers, but it had also left him with more questions. What would happen next? Could they salvage their marriage, or was it beyond repair? David didn't know. All he knew was that things could never go back to the way they were. The confrontation had marked a turning point, and the decisions ahead would shape the rest of their lives. For now, all he could do was take it one step at a time. After the confrontation, David knew he couldn't linger in limbo. The betrayal had shattered not just his trust, but the foundation of their life together. He spent days reflecting on what came next, his mind consumed by one thought: protecting Emma and Sophia. They were his priority now, their well-being the only thing that mattered. David reached out to a lawyer, a step that felt both foreign and final. "I need to know my options," he explained, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. The lawyer listened carefully, outlining the steps for a divorce. The word hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for so long. Divorce. It wasn't what he wanted, but it felt inevitable. He needed to prepare for the fallout. David began gathering documents, a process that felt surreal. Bank statements, property deeds, even messages exchanged with Azel, all were compiled with meticulous care. It felt like building a case, but this wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring his daughter's future. The house, their savings, the life they'd built. It was all intertwined, and now it had to be untangled. Azel, for her part, remained quiet, her once confident demeanor replaced by uncertainty. She hadn't protested when David mentioned lawyers, though her eyes reflected the weight of her choices. David couldn't bring himself to feel triumphant. There was no victory here, only a deep sense of loss. Each step forward felt necessary but heartbreaking, a reminder of what they were leaving behind. Conversations with the lawyer shifted from logistical to emotional. "Focus on your daughters," she advised. "Make sure they feel secure." David took those words to heart, pouring his energy into creating a sense of stability for Emma and Sophia. He adjusted his work schedule, ensuring he was present for bedtime stories and school pickups. They were too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, but their questions broke his heart. "Why is Mommy sad?" Emma had asked one night. David struggled to find the words, eventually settling on, "Sometimes grown-ups have hard days, but it's not your fault." He knew the coming months would be hard, but he was determined to shield them from as much pain as possible. As the legal process unfolded, David began to see Azel in a new light. She had made mistakes, huge ones, but she was still the mother of his children. The anger he once felt began to soften, replaced by a complicated mix of emotions. Forgiveness seemed distant, but not impossible. "We need to find a way to co-parent," he told her during one of their rare conversations. Azel nodded, her voice barely above a whisper as she agreed. It wasn't easy, and tension lingered in every interaction. But they both knew the girls deserved their best effort. Despite everything, David wanted to believe they could put their differences aside, for Emma and Sophia's sake. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about the family they'd created. By the time the divorce papers were filed, David felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't the ending he'd envisioned, but it was a step toward a new beginning. The process was far from over, and challenges still lay ahead, but he felt a glimmer of hope amidst the uncertainty. He began focusing on his own healing, finding moments of peace in the chaos. Therapy, time with friends, and moments of reflection helped him rebuild his sense of self. Azel, too, seemed to be navigating her own path, though their interactions remained brief and formal. As David looked at his daughters, he reminded himself why he was doing all this. Their happiness was his priority, and for them, he'd keep moving forward. After the divorce, Azel's life began to unravel in ways neither of them had anticipated. The weight of her choices became apparent as the consequences caught up with her. The whispers at work started first. Colleagues who had once admired her now avoided her gaze. Her boss, Jonathan, the man she had risked everything for, distanced himself once the rumors spread. David wasn't surprised when Azel confided in a rare moment of vulnerability that she had lost her job. "They said it's for the company's image," she admitted, her voice hollow. The career she had worked so hard to build was gone, and with it, a piece of her identity. David felt a twinge. Azel's family, once her strongest supporters, also began to pull away. Her parents, who had adored David and cherished their family unit, struggled to reconcile the image of their daughter with her actions. Visits with Emma and Sophia became tense, with Azel's parents growing distant and guarded. The support system she had relied on seemed to vanish, leaving her increasingly isolated. David noticed the change in her demeanor. She was quieter now, her confidence replaced by uncertainty. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for her. She was still the mother of his children after all, and watching. Her fall so far from grace was painful to witness, even from a distance. The effects of her actions rippled into her personal life as well. Friends who had once been her confidants stopped reaching out, their silence a reflection of the judgment she now faced. Azel began to withdraw, retreating into herself as the world around her grew smaller. David saw it in her interactions with the twins. She seemed distracted, her laughter forced, her smiles fleeting. He worried about the impact on Emma and Sophia, but he made sure they knew they were loved and supported. Co-parenting became more challenging as Azel struggled to navigate her new reality. David did his best to maintain civility, but the cracks in her life were impossible to ignore. As time went on, Azel's isolation deepened. She moved into a modest apartment, far from the life they had once shared. The woman who had once seemed so strong and self-assured now appeared fragile, struggling to find her footing. David heard through mutual friends that she was attending therapy, trying to rebuild herself piece by piece. It was a small step, but it gave him a glimmer of hope. Despite everything, he wanted her to find peace, not for her sake, but for their daughters. He hoped that someday she could be the mother Emma and Sophia deserved, even if they could never repair what had been broken between them. In the end, Azel's fall was both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the fragility of trust. She had lost her career, her reputation, and the family she had once cherished. But in her lowest moments, there was also the possibility of redemption. David, for his part, had begun to move forward, focusing on his daughters and the life he was rebuilding. Azel's journey was no longer his responsibility, but he hoped she would find her way. As he looked at Emma and Sophia, he reminded himself that this wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a story of resilience, growth, and the strength to rebuild after loss. And for that, he was grateful.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.